Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining, where in this video we'll be taking a look at how weapon damage scales from Carl, who are normally tested against, up to raid bosses. Now I say that as plural, but I'm actually only looking at one raid boss in this video, that being Taniks. And the reason for that is simply because my power level isn't high enough to cap out damage against Atheon or even Templar. For example, the recommended power for Templar is 1310, every weapon tested was above that, and my character's average power level was always between 1325 and 1330, yet the numbers were all over the place with no consistency between each type. I'll touch on this more towards the end of the video. Now, 15 weapons have been tested, and I didn't know there was going to be a power problem until they were all finished, so this means there was a lot of time and patience expended testing these against Taniks, of course. All of them tested twice against Templar, and again, all of them were tested against Atheon. Now, I'm not including the Vault of Glass numbers as they're all skewed, like I've already said, but that doesn't mean the time and effort that went into testing all of this should go unnoticed. So now will be a perfect moment to say a huge thank you to those who helped me through all of this and endured the pain of my repeated deaths and mistakes. Almost all of that help came from Clan Second Foundation, who in one sitting got me through the testing for all weapons against all 3 raid bosses, and then did it again a couple of days later minus Atheon. Their names are all on screen now, along with some others who helped along the way, while a special thank you in particular goes out to a member of Clan Second Foundation named Kuro, who not only helped every time, but organised the fire teams and even ensured we had checkpoints beforehand. I cannot thank Kuro and Clan Second Foundation enough. There's a link in the description down below to their Discord, although it has a 25-person join limit, so if it's something you'd like to check out, you better be quick. It's just a shame the VOG numbers weren't valid and they're going to have to do it with me again once my power level is high enough. And if the first round of testing is anything to go by, then there'll be an awful lot of deaths and wiping. So first of all, the method. The weapons tested are coming onto screen now, and I've tried to use a little bit of everything to get some broad data. No swords this time round, but they'll be added in the future. Remember, we're only interested in the damage difference between Carl and Taniks, as we're measuring how it scales. And this isn't so much to see how much change there is, but rather if there is any difference in said scaling between different weapon types, such as snipers and linear fusion rifles, for example. So don't worry about the perks on weapons, I'm not bothering to list them, but all you need to know is the exact same item was used against both Carl and Taniks. Of course, in almost all testing, I used major spec mods, so boss spec mods were equipped when recording numbers against the raid boss. Everything is at base values after that, so no divinity, no well, bubble, breach and clear, etc. This is just to test damage and the changes to determine any scaling factors. Now, what I'm going to do is show the clips on screen for every weapon tested and the damage it does against each target. This section is more for the purpose of evidence and referencing, so you know the numbers I'm telling you are true, and you can refer back at any point during the video. I'm not going to talk over any of this as there really isn't any point. The video does have chapters in the progress bar, so if you don't want to watch all of this, skip to the next section if you wish. So for anyone who watched that through, you may have noticed that all numbers against Taniks were less than that against Karl for the same weapon. The interesting thing though is that they didn't all reduce by the same relative amount. Coming onto screen now is a table for all of those showing the percentage change and scale factor or ratio. What this is showing from left to right is the weapon, the damage against Karl, the damage against Taniks, then the percentage change and finally the scale factor. The scale factor is the number you multiply Karl damage by to get Taniks damage. I've grouped everything based on the percentage change, starting with the smallest and moving down to the highest. For the first group of weapons, which is the top 4, their damage reduced by 14.1%. And what's interesting is these are all non-precision damaging weapons, so 2 rocket launchers, those being Deathbringer and Code Duello, a fusion rifle, which is Null Composure, and finally Xenophage. Now, maybe if I also compared the non-precision damage for everything, they might all have the same percentage change, but I don't test damage in DPS that way, so if anything is capable of precision damage, they're the numbers we're using. Moving on, the next group of weapons are 3 grenade launchers, Anarchy, Witherhoard and Interference 6. These 3 all had damage reduced by 18.2%. Remember, that's from Karl to Taniks. Then the linear fusion rifles, so Sleeper Simulant and Threaded Needle, which both had their damage per round reduced by 19%. I've used a relatively large sample size for snipers, so at least 1 from each slot, consisting of 2 exotics and 3 legendaries, and these had their damage per round reduced by 20.7%. All of them. And finally at the bottom is First In Last Out, which seen a damage reduction of 20.9%, although I would like to test that a few more times to validate the numbers, as I'm not so sure about that value. The scale factor, even for the weapons with the same percentage change, is slightly different for each, but that's only when you get to the 4th decimal place, which, let's be honest, doesn't matter in Destiny. That's a tiny amount, and I suspect is the result of some rounding up or down that's happening behind the scenes within the game. Now firstly, let's not look at this too negatively, glass half full and all that. Don't be angry that snipers appear to have a 20.7% nerf against Taniks, but rather that they have a 20.7%-ish buff against mages. The numbers are only this way round because I'm using damage against Karl as the datum. So what exactly does this mean and how does it affect DPS? Well, basically, where Weapon A might be better than Weapon B using damage numbers based on Karl, where a lot of people test damage, me included, that could be the opposite way round against a raid boss, with Weapon B being a better DPS option than Weapon A. Let me show you an example. On screen now is a graph and table showing 5 weapons that I've tested against Karl at some point over the past 2 seasons, those being Xenophage with Axiom Warwigs, Threaded Needle with Rapid Hit and Frenzy, Whisper of the Worm with its Catalyst and no delay to proc Whisper Breathing, Null Composure with high impact reserves, and finally Deathbringer with its Catalyst. Now, using the relevant scale factors that I showed earlier, remember it's different for some weapon types, and applying that factor to the DPS value, this is how they compare on the tables now. You can see that while DPS for every weapon has reduced, because they scale differently, in this example linear fusion rifles reduce more than non-precision weapons relative to the base numbers, therefore Xenophage now manages to pass Threaded Needle. That's what the little arrows are there to symbolise. The green one that's pointing up is next to Xenophage, as that's gone up a position, while the red one is pointing down next to Threaded Needle, as that's gone down a position. And taking a look at this on the graph, I'm going to take an image of the Karl graph and lay it over the graph for Taniks. So the slightly faded lines you can see are for the major, while the more solid lines are for the raid boss. Apologies if this is a little awkward to see. Now if you look just after 10 seconds for the Karl examples, which are faded, Threaded Needle pulls ahead of Xenophage and momentarily drops behind just after, when reloading. Whereas on the Taniks lines, which are the solid ones, at the same point it doesn't pull ahead, and when it falls behind just after, it's by a much bigger margin. It also falls behind Deathbringer after around 16 to 17 seconds, whereas when using Karl numbers, it near as damn it matches it. Whisper of the Worm suffers more in this example, taking much longer to open up a meaningful gap over Xenophage, and even when it does, it's much less than when basing numbers off of Karl. And just to reiterate, this isn't because damage numbers are simply less, this is because the damage for some weapon types reduce more than others, relative to the base numbers. Xenophage damage only reduces by 14.1% compared to linear fusion rifles, which is 19%, and snipers, which is 20.7%. That's the reason Xenophage makes ground on the other two and closes up any gaps. So why use a scale factor when I've been referencing percentages all this time? Simply because if you multiply the DPS of a weapon that's been tested against Karl by its scale factor, the result will be the DPS which that weapon theoretically does against that specific raid boss. In this test, it's currently only Taniks. As an example, take the base Carl damage of Whisper and multiply it by the scale factor, in this case 0.79315. Damage then drops to 584,331, divided by the time tested to do that damage, and DPS is 42,902. But if it's just one weapon being tested, for example it's not a sniper with Anarchy, then you can take the Carl DPS number, which for Whisper here is 54,091, and just multiply that by the scale factor, and the result is the same, 42,902. Just to make it clear, this is only relevant for converting damage or DPS numbers from Carl to Taniks. I'll cover Templar and eventually Atheon once my power level is high enough. Speaking of which, and keeping it brief, when testing against Taniks initially, which I believe is a 1250 encounter, my Guardian was somewhere around 1315 to 1320, while the Adored that I had equipped was at exactly 1250, the recommended power. After putting all the numbers into a table after testing, Adored was way lower than all the other snipers. So I infused it up to around 1315, went back in and tested against Taniks again. This time the damage numbers for Adored were higher and fell perfectly in line with other snipers regarding the scale factor or percentage reduction. So it seems, for raids at least, that not only does the weapon power matter as well as average Guardian power, but there's an advantage to be had by being above that recommended power level. And this would explain why a lot of the numbers against Templar was so inconsistent. Now, this is just an observation, and I may have overlooked something. It requires its own separate and controlled testing, which I may do a video on one day. Now, a very important question to answer that some might even be wondering. What's the future of the channel and its videos when DPS testing against Carl could now be considered inaccurate? Is there any point in testing against Carl, and am I even going to carry on? Well, the simple answer is yes, absolutely. You see, the damage numbers against Carl could well scale equally for all weapons against every other boss or enemy in the game. Strike and Nightfall bosses, champions, other mages, etc. I can't confirm this, but it's very possible. Raid bosses are unique after all, no two are the same and no other enemy is like a raid boss. I do have plans to accommodate this though. So, from here going forward, at the end of any videos where there's more than one weapon type included, I'll cycle through any relevant tables and graphs with the damage and DPS of the featured weapons adjusted for specific raid bosses. Of course, at the minute, I only have scale factors for Taniks and not every weapon type is being tested, but that will change over time. I want to test against the Vault of Glass bosses and any future raids for that matter, until we have a catalogue of weapon types, raid encounters with adjustments made that even if it's something I haven't specifically covered, there's nothing stopping you taking the relevant scale factor and applying it to Carl DPS numbers from a previous video. I've already taken steps and made improvements to the tools that I use, which will allow me, at the push of a few buttons, to convert Carl damage and DPS to that of any raid boss, ready for when I've tested against more. In the long term, because there's going to be a lot of information going forward, I plan to create a Discord to dump all of this data, the tables, the graphs, with all the numbers you need. And then, even more long term, I'm thinking about streaming after a video has gone live on YouTube, where we can have a short Q&A about the video, I can answer any questions, and also talk about any problems when testing and how they were overcome, etc. They're a while off yet. Anyway, just the start of this type of testing on the channel, but that is actually all from me. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful and interesting. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're not already, and give me any feedback in the comments down below. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.